Hey guys, welcome back. So today, a package arrived in the mail from MAXPEEDINGRODS. They're better known for their automotive performance equipment, such as connecting rods, turbos, and carburetors, but they also make a line of portable inverter generators, and they sent me their largest one to review and test. It's rated at 5,000 watts and can surge up to 5,500 watts. So let's get it out of the box and take a look. Looks like a very nice unit. And I was a little bit concerned that it wasn't going to make it here in one piece because the company that delivered it literally backed up to my garage, pushed it out of the back of the truck, and it was sitting sideways in my driveway. But it was packaged well because it seemed to have survived that ordeal. Anyway, I'm going to pause it here. We'll finish getting it out of the box, and then we'll take a closer look. Included in the box was a toolkit for changing the spark plug and removing the access panels. We have this oil fill tube, which just screws in to where the dipstick goes to help you fill the engine with oil without making a mess. And we got a few plugs here for making your own cords. Two of them are at 120 volts, a 15 amp and a 30 amp. And we also have a plug here, 30 amps at 240 volts. And of course, the user manual. Anyway, before diving into the features, I want to get oil in this engine. Most small engines, they ship with little to no oil. And the last thing you want to do is to start your new engine without any oil in it. Now, this does have an oil sensor, but yeah, you don't want to test it. So let's get some oil in the engine. This is the access panel for the oil fill. And the quick disconnect for the battery. This is electric start, has a lithium ion battery, and it also has a starter recoil as a backup. You can see these are the connections for the battery hookup. And there's also an oil drain that you would just remove this cap, tip the generator, and the oil would come right out. And that's what we're after right there. That is the oil fill. For break-in, I'm just going to use conventional oil. That'll help the parts wear in together. And once the engine is broken in after a couple hours, you want to make sure you change the oil and put synthetic in. It took almost exactly a quart of oil. And you can see we're filled up right to the last thread, and that's where you want to be. So get the dipstick back in, connect up that battery, and we should be good on this side. The only other thing on this side of the generator is that manual starter recoil in case the battery is dead. But in most cases, you won't need that. That is just a backup. You know, on the back side is just the exhaust. And of course, on this side is the control panel. This has most of the stuff you'll be interested in. We'll cover that in a second. And down here is access to the battery should you need to change it. And this side, it is just a removable panel, so you can access the spark plug, the valves, the airbox, and the carburetor. So we'll take a look in there in a minute, but let's take a closer look at this control panel first. To start the generator, it's a pretty simple process. You just turn this knob all the way to the right, that turns the fuel on and engages the choke. You then just depress the red button to engage the starter, and once it's running, you just turn it to on, which turns the choke off. And when you're done using it, you turn it all the way to the left, which kills the spark, shutting the engine down, and it also shuts the fuel off. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that when starting an inverter generator, usually you want to have the eco switch off. That'll run the engine at the fastest speed, allow the engine to build some heat and stabilize, and after a couple minutes, you can switch it to on. That'll slow the engine down and quiet it down, and also save on fuel. But if you're going to put a sudden heavy load on, you want to turn that eco switch off. You want to have the engine running fast so it can absorb the load without stalling. But in normal conditions, you can leave this in the on position, and the engine will respond to changes in load as long as it's not too much, too fast. Now, there are 4 outputs. We have 3 AC outputs and 2 DC outputs in the form of USB. On the AC side, we have 120 volts, GFCI protected with a 20 amp outlet. Here is a 30 amp outlet, also at 120 volts, and a 30 amp outlet at 240 volts. Now, these are protected by both the inverter module and an analog circuit breaker, which is good. A lot of inverters don't have the analog circuit breaker. They purely rely on the inverter to sense a problem and shut the output down. But in this case, there is a backup in case things really go wrong. That will always function as it should. There's also a carbon monoxide detector, which will alert when there's a problem. And here is a display, which gives you a lot of information. On the left is an indicator of the load from 0 to 100%. We also have a digital fuel gauge from 100 down to 0. And here are some indicator lights: low oil, overload, and this one just indicates that the AC power is on and everything is normal. And here is also a digital display that most likely will show us the voltage, the hertz, and the runtime. So we'll check that out when it's running. But for now, let's get that side panel off and take a look inside. And this might be the best feature. And here is where you would access the airbox if you need to clean or replace that filter. Carburetor's right behind there. There is a drain screw right there. So once you're done using it, you can just crack that screw loose and it's going to drain all the fuel out of that carburetor. And you definitely want to do that because if the fuel goes bad in the tank, that's one thing. It's pretty easy to deal with as long as the tank hasn't rusted out. But if it goes bad in the carburetor, then you're looking at taking it apart, cleaning it, and possibly replacing it. Over here, or under here, I should say, is the valve cover. So when you need to adjust the clearance, you can do that right there. And the spark plug is located there. So I'm actually going to get that plug out. I want to put a little bit of oil in the cylinder before the first start. I'm going to use the provided tool to remove the spark plug, but I'm also going to drop a magnet down there to kind of hold that plug in place because this engine, it's covered in a plastic shroud. And the idea is it pulls air in from the front of the unit where the control panel is. It goes through, staying within the shroud, and then exits the back of the engine. Now, theoretically, if you drop the plug in the right spot, it could get caught between the engine and this plastic, and I don't want that to happen. I'm adding about a tablespoon of oil. It will cause smoke, definitely at startup, but in this case it's a good thing. It means the top end is well lubricated, and that's what you want for the first start. I'm just going to bump the start button to get that oil to spread around a bit. That should be good. Before I put that cover back on, there's one thing I like to double check, and that's the calibration of that knob that controls the ignition, the fuel, and the choke. A lot of times the choke is miscalibrated, so when you have it in the run position, sometimes the choke is still on, and that's what I want to double check. So I'm going to turn the knob all the way to start, which engages the choke. And then if I look at the carburetor and start turning that knob back, you can see the choke moving. And when it stops moving, which is right there, if everything's calibrated correctly, we should be in the run position. And we are. We're exactly in the run position, so this is calibrated correctly. Just as a comparison, I brought my Honda out and put it side by side. You can see it is larger, it weighs about twice as much, and costs 4 times as much, but only produces 500 more watts. You know, at the time, 17 years ago, when I bought that Honda generator, there really weren't any other options in that size class, so I spent a bunch of money to get quiet, clean power. But today, there's more options. I didn't see in the manual a recommended break-in procedure for this engine, but the important thing to keep in mind is that most small engines do not have an oil filter. In the first few hours of operation, the components are wearing in to each other, and little bits of metal will get in that oil, and you don't want to leave it in the engine for too long. You definitely want to change the oil within the first 3 to 5 hours. In my case, I'm going to start it with the eco switch on. I want the engine to run slow for about 15 minutes. I'll let it warm up, and then I'm going to put about a half load on it, run it for an hour, bring it in, and change the oil, and repeat that process a couple times until the engine is fully broken in. I'm just going to wait a second for the carburetor to fill with fuel before trying to start it. So far, so good. All that smoke, that was due to the oil I put in the cylinder, and that was expected. It's actually a good thing. It means everything's well lubricated for the first start, but it has completely burned off at this point. Everything looks normal here. We're at 0% load. It's been running for about 0.1 hours because we have the green status light indicating the AC is on. 143.6 volts out on the 240 and 121.9 on the 120. And the fuel tank, it is 75% full. So I'm going to let this run for another minute or so and then start putting a load on it. I put a 1500 watt load on it. It's about 30% load, and it's handling it without issue. So I think I'm going to keep it just like this for the duration of the hour. And once that hour is up, I'll change the oil and repeat the process a couple times until the engine is fully broken in. So I'm going to cut the video here. I'm going to break it into two parts. The second part, I'll focus on testing the power output quality, the sound output level, and then I'll load test it right at 5,000 watts, make sure it can handle that load without issues. So if you want to find out more information about this generator, I'll leave it down in the description. And I wanted to thank Max Speeding Rods for sending me this to review. I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.